Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, members and guests. Welcome to the very first meeting of the new club year for the West Shore Photography Club. I'm Dennis Baker, your president, and we'll get this meeting started now. Just a couple of orders of business. Since it is the beginning of a new club year, we are asking that you renew your dues. When we ended the club year, we had 145 active members, and my goal is to keep everybody on board and to pick up some new people. So we hope you'll do that. A lot of you have already paid your dues. So I'm talking to those who have not. I did not take the time to respond to everybody who paid their dues, but I will be notifying the people who haven't paid in a few weeks to remind them personally. Let me mention the names of the newest members. We've had 3 people who've joined the club in the last 3 weeks. Pat Early just spoke a minute ago. He's from Carlisle. Patrick Grill joined just before he did, a couple of days. So 2 Patricks. He's not with us at the moment, I don't think. And Jennifer Wick from Carlisle just joined. And just this afternoon, she was putting up a gallery on our website of her pictures from the Lesher sunflower fields. So you might check those out on the website. The dues, of course, are $25, and there's 2 ways to pay, and I'll remind you of this in the email that goes out tomorrow as the follow-up. One is to do PayPal, which is very simple. You just go to the website, easy to do. You don't even have to have an official PayPal account. And the other way is to send a check to our treasurer, Rick Hudson, who's online, and I'll put his address in the email tomorrow. So as standard practice, after every meeting, I send out a follow-up email with a link to the recording and other, appropriate information. So along with tomorrow's email, I'll send you a copy of the upcoming activities for the club. And we have lots of things happening. Here's an interesting little note. We are teaming with Fine Art Photo to come up with some West Shore Photography Club apparel. We're going to have T-shirts, possibly sweatshirts. And right now, if you didn't see the email that I sent out this afternoon, we're trying to decide on a logo. So I sent out through the email distribution system 5 samples that Fine Art Photo sent us. Some black backgrounds, some white backgrounds, and a couple of different logos. So would you please look at those and vote for your favorite? We're going to come up with one favorite logo for Fine Art, and then they'll be available for purchase through Fine Art Photo.
And Dennis, while you're on Fine Art Photo,
yes,
I'll mention that they have a coupon for us for 20%, or is it 20? Yeah, 20% off on printing that you have. And we have a stack of their coupons. And if you come to our trips, we'll give you one, except this Saturday, I forgot to bring them, so I didn't pass them out. But we do have these for if you attend to our trips. So
very good. We meet online approximately every other Monday night. So next Monday night, there's no meeting. Our next meeting will be on Monday, September the 25th at 7 o'clock. And we have a very pertinent topic, artificial intelligence. So there's a photographer who's studied this extensively, has a presentation prepared for us. His name is Bert Sirkin, and his presentation is entitled, How is AI Shaping Our Craft? That'll be on the 25th. Okay, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our Vice President, Joe Farrell. He's going to talk about trips and introduce our outstanding guest speaker for this evening. Joe?
Okay, thanks, Dennis. We had 2 trips since our last meeting. We had one to the Lesher farms for sunflowers, and that was a really fantastic sunflowers. As far as you could see, there were sunflowers. It was really, really cool. And Steve Boutte led that trip. He's not on tonight, so I'm giving that little update on his behalf. And then on Saturday, we went to Frederick, Maryland for a really, really cool, beautiful town, much like Lidditz is, without any major stores. And it was fantastic. And so Don, you were on that trip yesterday, right, Don?
Don, yes, I was. Yes, I was. And it was, can you hear me okay?
Yes, hear you fine.
Okay, great. And it was very delightful. We met with the Frederick Kleck camera club right near Delaplane, and had various groups of individuals from them, from their club, give us opportunities to see certain things, whether it be historical or public art or the church spires that are there. And we broke up into groups. I chose the group that was kind of like the special gems that are around Frederick, which are the alleys and the theaters and things like that. And we found some fantastic images along the way. If we go back, I do suggest something I didn't realize until I left, that the best place to photograph the church spires is from the parking garages, the one that we were at, for example. So okay. Keep that in mind. But it was tremendous, good camaraderie, and I really hope the club continues to do this with other clubs, because it was a lot of fun. I ended up spending actually 4.5 hours there. So,
oh my gosh, okay, that's why you
it was great.
That's why you have that tan on your face now, huh? Because it's fun, yeah.
Yeah, you got it. It did get hot. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Don. We have some upcoming trips. One of them is to Lake Tobias, which is it's an African kind of a safari deal. And it's about an hour away from us here in Mechanicsburg. And we have reserved a bus for us, and we have reserved early access. So we have complete access for the park just for us, and we have a bus for us, and they have like 10 of them that go around, and you mimic what an African safari would be like, and it is a really cool thing to do. And so we have the bus because you have a seat for everybody, so you don't have to be juggling between people and to try and get some photographs. So we ask that you that email will go out tomorrow morning with the announcement, and then we do ask for your name as a reservation for that, because we can only take 24 people for that particular trip. Then we have the Bower, which is a garden sanctuary. It's up in Perry County, and through Judy Keim and her input, we have that reserved for a full day here in October. And we have unfettered access for the whole property, and it's just going to be us. And that also is a reservation, and there's no charge for that, but they do ask for a small donation, which we will do. And so that's coming up. And in addition to that, we have some waterfalls here lined up for the fall. And we also are working on the old cemetery in Harrisburg, and that's a really cool location. We're working on that. So those are our trips that we have. And any questions on that, we can entertain them. Or if you have a suggestion for one, please email myself, Joe Farrell, or to Dennis Baker, and we will get that into the trips committee. And so that's what we got to do. That's what we'd ask you to do. So tonight, we are so pleased to have Ian Plant. There he is, waving away to us there. Ian is by far one of the most masterful photographers you're going to find. We call him in the industry Mr. Wide Angle, because he is always down on his knees and getting his lens right into the foreground element and photographing. And that's one of his real specialties. He is an absolute master as it comes to composition. And so we're really, really pleased to have him. He is owns a firm called Photo Masters. It's an online system. He's written many ebooks and has videos and classes. And we really will recommend that you go to his site. And I just watched one of his videos this afternoon. I'm a member of his Photo Masters, and it was on using a short telephoto lens for landscape. And some people will look at you and say, landscape telephoto? Yes. And he's going to explain that. And that's a really cool video that's part of the Photo Masters program that he has. So tonight, Ian's going to be talking to us about the art of photography. Ian, I'm going to turn it over to you. Oh, wait, fantastic. One second, Ian. I forgot one of this. We're going to mute everybody, and we're going to have you muted. And then if you put your questions into chat, we'll be monitoring that, because a lot of times what happens is the question you may have will get answered later on. And then when we feel that there's an opportunity to ask Ian the question, we will do that. But we will have open mic at the end of it for sure. And also we're recording the session. So Ian, it's all yours.
Fantastic, Joe. Thank you very much for the kind words and the warm welcome. Thank you, Dennis, as well. Yeah, it is funny that I put out that webinar on using a short telephoto lens, because at the beginning of the webinar, I'm like, you know what? I'm not really sure that I know what I'm talking about here, because I shoot everything with a wide angle lens. I guess it's fair to say that I'm a bit of a wide angle addict, but more than that, I'm a photography addict. I just absolutely love the art of photography and how it's different from other forms of art. And I think that this discussion that I'm having tonight really tries to nail down what it is that is unique and special about photography, and how you can lean into those unique, special aspects of photography to produce artistic images. And I think that this question of, what makes photography special, what it is about photography that I love and that everyone here loves, I think it becomes increasingly relevant in this day and age of AI and other computer manipulation that people are using. And this is increasingly a challenge that we're all going to have to deal with. And it's a topic I know that everyone's talking about. So I'm going to talk about what I think is special about photography, what I think makes it unique as an art form, and how you can use the features of photography that make it different to create artistic images that will stand out and get noticed. So I'm going to dive right in. I'm just going to send around a link in the chat, the group chat, to my free webinar that you can register for on Photo Masters if you want to learn more from me. And now, because no one wants to look at me, they'd rather look at my photos, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and start my presentation. Just want to make sure that, hold on one second. Let me just close that out. And Joe, just let me know if you can see everything full screen. Everything looks good?
It looks great, Ian.
All right, fantastic. So I'm going to dive right in. So as Joe said, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat and he will monitor the questions and he will jump in if there's anything relevant to what I'm discussing. If not, we can wait until the end and answer any questions. And if you want to learn more about photography, learn more from me, check out photomasters.com. Use the link that I provided in the chat to access my free webinar, which is really very useful for learning all sorts of photography techniques and learning more about the art of photography. So what is it that makes photography different from other forms of visual art? I think part of it is that cameras and lenses have these built-in limitations. They kind of fundamentally change the way the world looks. And I'm going to talk about that in more detail. But I think what's also really unusual about photography among art forms is that it's tethered to the moment. So basically, a photograph just captures a finite slice of time. And what's also unique about photography is that it's tethered to reality. So capturing that moment, you're capturing something that happens in the real world. And I think this is a real important way that photography is distinguished from other forms of art. And I want to drill down on this idea that the camera has these limitations. Basically, these limitations make the camera see the world in a different way than your eyes would see it. So one of these ways that the camera sees things differently, and I'm going to be talking about this a lot in this presentation, is that it has a limited dynamic range. It can't see the full range of tones from shadow to light that the human eye can perceive. And so that limited dynamic range is an important way that when you take a photograph, how the camera changes the way the world looks. Cameras also express colors differently than the way the eye perceives it. There's no film or image sensor that's going to capture color and light the same way that the human brain, the human eye working together perceives those things. So some of these changes to reality are subtle, some are more significant. Different focal lengths also change the way the world looks. And another thing about photography that changes the way we perceive the world is that it captures light in a cumulative fashion. So when we see the world with our eyes, we're basically seeing it like a video. And a photograph creates this static capture, captures this single moment and freezes it. But if you have a long exposure, you can record all of that light cumulatively. And that is going to change the way the camera expresses reality compared to the way the eye see it. So a good example of this would be that when it's very dark out, your eyes can't gather the light, and so you can't see very well. But with a camera, if you do a long enough exposure, then you can actually make even the darkest night look as bright as the middle of the day. So if you do like an 8-hour exposure all night, the final result might actually even be overexposed. So all these things basically change, the camera changes the way the world looks. And lenses also add to that. So I mentioned earlier that, focal lengths change the way that the camera sees the world. There's not a focal length out there that approximates human sight. So it doesn't matter what lens we're using, we're never really going to be seeing the world the same way that a human being would see it. Even when we talk about what's considered sort of the normal focal range, like 40 to 50 millimeters is considered to be closest to approximating human sight, it still doesn't really see the world the same way that our eyes see it. And the more extreme focal lengths will alter the perception of reality in a much more noticeable way. So an extreme telephoto will produce a look that is very different from the way our eyes perceive the world. And it's the same thing with my favorite extreme ultra wide angle lenses. So another way that the camera and lenses working together change the way we perceive the world is that photos are in 2 dimensions. You lose depth in a photograph, and it's the same thing with painting. And with photography, you can isolate a portion of the scene and remove the rest of the scene from the viewer's inspection. So that's another way that the camera and the lens working together can alter the perception of reality. And, an example of this might be, you might be driving down a road and it's just littered with trash. And there's old broken down cars on the side of the road, but you see this beautiful dogwood tree that's blooming. And you just zoom in and photograph that dogwood. Anyone looking at that picture won't see all the trash that's all around it. You're isolating a portion of the scene. You're altering reality through the capture process of making a photograph, through that photographic process. And also your choice of the moment that you pick to trigger the shutter is going to change the way the world looks. You're going to take that single moment. You can arrest motion at its peak activity. You can take a picture when visual elements are converging in a really interesting way before they just go on their way and there's no longer any sort of artistic relevance to the scene anymore. So all of these things will alter the perception of reality. And what makes photography different than painting, for example, is that painting is a creation media. So the painter creates the final product. They can start from scratch. They start with a blank canvas and they're free to create anything that their heart desires. But photography is a capture media, which means it's bound by reality. So film or digital sensors react to light and can only recreate what is in front of the camera lens. And obviously you can bring a photograph into Photoshop or into an AI engine or something like that, and you can use it as a raw component to some sort of mixed media art. But any photograph that you take is going to be tethered to the reality that was actually in front of your camera and lens. And to me, that's what makes photography so special, is that the photographer is plucking a slice of reality from the living world, freezing forever that fleeting moment. So you can share it with others so that they might partake in that experience themselves, if only in a small way. And your job as a photographer is to translate that experience, translate what you saw through this creative photographic process so that it delivers maximum impact to the viewer so that they can extract that experience in the biggest way possible. And I think that this connection with reality that's at the heart of photography is really important to people. People are inspired by photography because in large part, they believe that the photograph is real or is connected to something that really happened. I mean, I remember years ago, I used to do an art show fair in Washington, D.C. There was this weekly flea market. I gave up on that after a long time because sitting outside in a booth in the DC summer heat is a miserable way to make a living as a photographer. But I did do it for several months. And the question I got asked more than any other question when people were thinking of buying one of my prints was, is this real or was this photoshopped? They wanted to know that it was real. That's what makes photography special. So that connection to reality, I think, is a really important thing. Now, I've talked about reality is captured through the photographic process. So using the camera and the lens does alter our perception of reality in subtle or significant ways. That's the reality that I'm really talking about. You're not looking to capture a faithful rendition of the scene right in front of you. You're using the process that is unique to photography, that photographic process, to alter reality, but still capture something that really happened. So to me, that limited view of reality that the camera offers is what makes photography unique, or rather, that's what's unique to photography compared to painting or some other type of visual art. And so, because the camera cannot capture that same range from light to dark, and no camera focal length is going to capture the scene the same way as perceived by our eyes, we can use these limitations to blur and alter reality captured through the photographic process in powerful ways. And that's what I'm going to talk about tonight, is some of the ways that I use these limitations of the camera system. Instead of trying to work around them, I embrace the limitations of the equipment. I don't see them as limitations. I see them as unique abilities that allow you to make artistic photographs that are going to get noticed. So you can get around, for example, the limited dynamic range by doing HDR imaging. You can do exposure blending. I mean, I do that sort of thing all the time. Focus stacking to get around limits of depth of field. I have no problem embracing these technical workarounds, but I more often than not, go the opposite way and embrace the camera's limitations rather than trying to find a way to do an end run around them. And I think ultimately your goal is to create this vicarious experience, this vicarious thrill for the viewer, that connection to reality that makes photography so special. You want to give the viewer a sense of being there with you when you took the picture. And your photos are a translation of the experience that you had. So you don't really necessarily need to be completely faithful to reality when you are engaging in the photographic process. You're translating that experience. So, for example, when you zoom in on the blooming dogwood and exclude all the garbage, you're just trying to focus the viewer on the beauty, and you're trying to isolate and remove all of the junk. And that's the experience you want to extract for the viewer. It's a real experience, it's really there, but it's a limited, truncated view of the world. And so that's what you're doing, is making this translation. And I think the keys to making extraordinary photographs involve, first of all, dispensing with this idea that you are capturing reality. You shouldn't be looking to just create a mere documentary record of what you are witnessing. Instead, with each and every photo, you should be trying to impose your own artistic vision on the scene or the subject that you're photographing. And you should strive to make photos that tell viewers as much about you as an artist as they do about your subject. And Ansel Adams, I think, said this best. You don't take a photograph, you make it. And that is at the heart of what it is I'm trying to convey in this presentation tonight. Okay, so one thing that I think is very important when you're making photographs is to learn to engage in the process of artistic abstraction. And famous photographer Minor White has a weird quote that I think sums this up. And that is, one should not only photograph things for what they are, but what else they are. And so the idea behind this is that you're learning to see visual elements, objects within the real world for what else they are. And what else they are the shapes or the colors that they create. So learning to see these in abstract artistic terms So when you look at a mountain, you're not just seeing a mountain, you're also seeing the triangle shape that the mountain forms, or you're seeing the light that's on the mountain and how that might react to the shadows. Learning to sort of disassemble the visual world and to see all of these constituent abstract parts, I think is really key to making artistic images. And it's going to allow you to see creative possibilities that other people might miss. So I think this photograph on this slide is a good example. This was taken on the Oregon coast. And people go to the Oregon coast to photograph the beautiful sea stacks there, the coastal scenery. And in this wide angle scene, the coastal scenery is pushed to the background. Instead, I made this photograph more about the abstract artistic shape formed by the seaweed in the foreground. I was attracted to it because of that really nice curving shape. And it was wet, so it was reflecting very well. And so it's got this sheen of light on it, so it stands out. And I was also attracted to the deep shadow created by the sea stack as the sun was setting behind it. So looking at this scene, I wasn't thinking about the scenery. I wasn't thinking about all the things that everyone else goes there to see. I was thinking about these abstract visual elements and figuring out a way to put them all together. This is basically the art of composition. And composition is a topic that's near and dear to me. I've written and talked about it extensively. I've got a whole ebook and video course called Visual Flow and the Ultimate Photography Composition course. And these are available on my PhotoMaster site, where I talk a lot about composition and really drill down deep into the secrets of making stunning visual designs. But it all starts with learning to see these visual abstractions. And I think it's a good idea to maybe look at some abstract art to get an idea of what you should be looking for. So abstract paintings, for example, are basically taking visual elements and reducing them to their barest essence. So when you look at abstract paintings, there are maybe just a few shapes and colors and textures that are put together. Like you can maybe see the scene, but it's a very sort of blurry, hazy, undefined version of the scene. And I don't think you need to make photographs that are abstract art, though you certainly can go that way. But I think doing abstract art is a great way of learning how to see the world in terms of shape and color and texture and all these other things that are the building blocks of successful composition. And it allows you to get creative with these compositional elements in a way that you really couldn't do if you don't practice this. And it allows you to see things that other people might not see and capture photographs that other people might not think of capturing. So the following photographs are a series of aerials that it's a part of a project I've been recently working on to photograph salt marshes using my drone. And salt marshes are not very exciting photographically, at least from the ground. They might be cool if you're doing wildlife photography, because there are a lot of wildlife subjects that are interesting in salt marshes. But if you're doing landscape photography of salt marshes, it's probably not the most interesting thing in the world. But from the air, it suddenly becomes this tapestry of abstract visual elements, of these patterns and these shapes and these beautiful colors. And so exploring this area using my drone, looking for all these abstract artistic elements and putting them together, creating this, what I think is probably the most abstract art that I do, is something that's completely unique. No one else is doing this as far as I know. And I'm taking something that most people would overlook as a landscape photography project and finding this sort of hidden beauty and unearthing it, translating it for the viewer. So doing this sort of artistic art, this abstract art, is a really great way of practicing compositional skills. And so I do it a lot. And so composition is one important way that you can use the photographic process to distort and manipulate the reality of the scene before you. And I'm not going to dive in too deeply into composition in this presentation. That's better left for maybe another presentation. Or if you want to check out my ebook Visual Flow and my video course, the Ultimate Photography Composition course, definitely do that. There's lots to learn. But the very basic thing of composition is to learn to see the world in terms of the shapes that the objects and your subjects create. Shapes are the building blocks of successful compositions, and you must learn to recognize these shapes to become a better photographer. And it's pretty easy. Look for simple shapes, look for curves, circles, spirals, triangles, and lines, and use them as the building blocks of your compositions. So, for example, with this photograph of Thomas's leaf monkey in Indonesia, I was taking a break. I was trekking for orangutans on the island of Sumatra, and I sat down, and this monkey came and sat down right next to me, which was a really thrilling close encounter. And so I put on a wide-angle lens. Actually, I put on a fisheye lens. The monkey was close enough that I could get close with the fisheye lens. And the reason I chose the fisheye was that a fisheye makes straight lines look curvy. And I wanted to have a lot of curve into this composition because I had this beautiful curving vine that the monkey was sitting on. I loved that curving shape, and I wanted to mirror that shape and complete it with the fisheye. So the curving trees on the right basically mirrored that curving shape, and they bring the eye all the way back to the beginning. So those are two of the most prominent shapes in this composition. There are a bunch of other shapes as well. The monkey's tail acts as a leading line, pushing in from the lower right to the main subject. The tree in the background creates a triangle. These are all powerful shapes, and putting these shapes together can allow you to simplify visual disorder and to, in essence, manipulate the scene in front of you so that it's coherent for the viewer. So this is part of the process of translating this messy visual chaos in front of you. You kind of have this truncated view. You limit your view based on your focal length and your position and your composition. And so you take that manipulated view compared to the reality as seen by your eyes and present that to the viewer. So here's just another example of using shapes prominently in my composition. This was in the Gobi Desert of Mongolia, and this is a frozen river. And when the sun came out, I knew that the river was going to that the sun was going to illuminate all the ice and make that shape really stand out. So I was attracted by the really dramatic S curving of the river leading into the background. The shape of this iceberg in Greenland was revealed. I used a drone to make this photograph. And as I circled around the iceberg, the shape changed. So I selected a position where the shape was at its most dynamic, this dynamic diamond shape. And the shape was further emphasized by the difference between the light and the shadow. So there's this sunset light on the right side of the iceberg, and then the rest of the scene is in shadow. So that color contrast, that's something I'm going to talk about a little bit later as well. So you can see that diamond shape that basically arises from the iceberg. And it's not perfect. Sometimes to see these graphic shapes, you need to squint a little bit. And by squinting, you're basically looking at the world as if you're seeing it as an abstract piece of art. This is a sandstone cave along the south shore of Lake Superior. In the winter, these caves freeze from the inside out. They become these ice caves. And for this photograph, I relied heavily on the curving shape formed by the pile of ice shards in the cave. So that became the prominent shape in the composition. And then, of course, there's a bunch of other shapes. You got all these leading lines that are creating these diagonal lines that are pushing in, and they are converging the viewer to the background. So basically, a composition is learning how to make all the shapes work together. And here's another example of shapes. I intentionally chose a position here where all of the gorillas were sort of bunched up so that all of these visual elements working together create this fishhook C curving shape that brings the viewer through the composition. I took this photograph in Uganda. I've been fortunate enough to trek with mountain gorillas in the 3 countries where they live, Uganda, Rwanda, and the Congo. It's been an incredible experience working with these animals. Okay, so composition is one way that you can change the reality as perceived by the eyes and translate that for the viewer. Exposure is another way. And this is one of my favorite ways of making artistic images, is to push your camera's dynamic range to the edge. I love working on the edge of light. Contrast in a scene reveals texture and shapes, and not everything needs to be bright. I think that folks rely too much on HDR And everything in the scene, whether it's in the light or in the shadows, ends up being pretty similar in brightness. But I think that darkness will sometimes reveal more than the light. And when you bring up a lot of shadow detail, you're often bringing up detail that's not important or that might be distracting from your main subject. So I love working in harsh contrasty light. For example, like with this ring-tailed lemur in Madagascar, I'll be going back to Madagascar next year to lead a photo tour. That's going to be a lot of fun. The wildlife there is amazing. So one thing to think about is this idea of proper exposure. I think we spend a lot of time trying to get the correct or the right exposure, but there's really no such thing, or as I have in this typo, there's no such things as a correct exposure. I've been using this slide for several years now, and I've never noticed that I had this typo, this extra S that doesn't belong there until now. Exposure is a subjective artistic choice. And I will creatively use what others might perceive as under or overexposure when I'm making photos. So proper exposure, the only correct exposure is the exposure that you want. So for example, with this photo of a priest in Ethiopia, there are all these rock-hewn churches in the highlands of Ethiopia, and there's not a lot of modern comfort in these churches, no electricity, things like that. You go in there, like I hiked up to the top of this mountain in the dark in the morning, just to photograph the priests in their church in the dark, reading their Bibles by candlelight. And to me, the exposure here, having most of the scene in full silhouette being completely dark, and having only the priest, the candle, and his Bible revealed by the light, and then a little bit of light on the wall behind him, you get a little bit of a shadow. That to me was a much more graphic and compelling way of telling the story than if I had tried to open up the exposure and show more of the background. This really focuses the viewer on the most important part of the story that I'm telling. And I like to use bright exposure sometimes. This is called high key. So high key images are basically white on white. So you have something that's maybe just a little bit, south of white in the image. So this is a photograph of two polar bears in the Alaskan Arctic squaring off. They're having a brawl. It was actually two large cubs, and they were just play fighting for several hours in this horrible blizzard. Visibility was almost completely zero. It was really difficult to lock on focus when I was photographing these bears, very challenging. But I loved the scene. I was out there freezing, photographing this scene for an hour because I just love that high key look, that white on white. You can barely see the polar bears with the white surroundings around them. They just barely come out of the white. They're barely visible. And that allowed me to create this very abstract image of the polar bears locked in battle. And here's swinging over to the other side. This image is mostly in silhouette. I took this photo in Namibia. Joe, I can't remember if you were there for this or not. But I remember I was with a group, and I told everyone we had these flamingos offshore at sunset, and it was a bright sunny day. So the reflection of the sun in the water was very strong. So I told everyone, find a good flamingo and then run to the left or the right so that you can get the stripe of the reflection of the sun surrounding the flamingo. So it was just kind of funny watching all my tour clients running back and forth because the flamingos were moving. And of course, the sun was shifting in position ever so slightly as it was sinking. And so you might have a flamingo lined up perfectly, then it would move. So you'd run along with it to keep it centered within that stripe. And because the reflection of the sun was so bright in the water, this exceeded the camera's dynamic range. So rather than trying to do like an HDR and bring up all that texture around it, just let it go dark, let it go black, let it go completely into silhouette. So this is a very graphic representation of the animal, and it's an abstract rendering of the subject. So I think it's a bit more artistic, and it's a way of sort of embracing the camera's limitations to create a more artistic and more eye-catching image. And so working on the edge of light is something I'd love to do, pushing the boundaries of the camera's dynamic range, which, by the way, gets more and more difficult as dynamic range improves. So a lot of times your camera's dynamic range might actually be able to handle the full range from light to dark in a scene. So when you're processing the image, you might actually have to add some contrast to get that silhouette look. But another thing I like to do is to juxtapose shadow and light. So having a mixed light scene. If the light is coming in from the side, the shadows can define the shapes, they can add texture, they can add that feeling of 3D realism. So when you take a photograph, I mentioned earlier, you're losing depth, you're losing the third dimension. And so you've got to create the illusion of depth in your photographs. And one way you can do that is to have some texture. So when painters and people who draw are making art, they will shade objects to give them a three-dimensional look. And with photography, it's the same thing. We're not shading them with a pencil or a brush. We're just shading them with the existing light. And I mentioned earlier that sometimes shadows will reveal more than the light. Another way to think about it is that shadows conceal detail and the highlights reveal. So it's really, you can emphasize something that's in the light by having lots of shadow around it. But really, I think what shadow does, besides creating texture, is you can use it creatively to de-emphasize parts of the photograph, part of the scene that might not be attractive or that might not contribute in a positive way to the composition. And you can use the juxtaposition of shadow and light to create patterns and layers in your composition. So angled lighting on the landscape, for example, is something that landscape photographers are looking for quite often when they're making photos. But you can do it also with wildlife and other types of photography. So this is a photograph of a cheetah in Namibia, and there was very strong side lighting on the cheetah at sunrise. I'm often looking for that position that is going to emphasize or optimize the lighting. And so getting into a position when there's strong light in the landscape so that I get that side lighting or backlighting, which I'll talk about in a little bit, is something that I do on purpose. And once again, working with that contrasty light is great. I'll intentionally underexpose the image. So I'm exposing for the highlights, making sure that the highlights are properly exposed at the very least, and often pulling that exposure down because I want to have everything that's in shadow to go into silhouette. So that really helps emphasize the subject. So the background here wasn't that interesting. So letting it go dark, emphasizing the side-lit cheetah makes it stand out, makes this a much more compelling and artistic portrait. And when you're working with something like sand dunes, you want that shadow and light because it reveals the texture of the dunes. It reveals all the ripples and the difference between the valleys and the crests in the dune. And you can create these pattern images where you have multiple layers of light and dark that help lead the viewer deeper into the scene. And side lighting is great, but I love shooting into the light for drama and artistic effect. This really forces you to push the dynamic range limits of your camera, and backlighting and rim lighting at sunrise and sunset can be very colorful and very beautiful. And when you're making these types of photos, you've got to expose carefully. You have to make sure your highlights are not overexposed. And you are going to end up letting much of the scene, or most even, falling into silhouette. The shadows are going to go dark. So you've got to be selective to make sure that the shadows you include in the image are going to contribute to the overall visual design. And I just tell people, embrace the darkness, the power of silhouette. Silhouette is just one of the most amazing things about photography, and something that's very, very different than other forms of visual art. You don't really see silhouette as much when people are making paintings, for example. And so I love working with silhouettes. Now, I said earlier that you got to expose carefully, make sure your highlights aren't blown out. If you're including the sun in the photo, chances are you're never going to avoid having a little bit of overexposure or a lot, because the sun is much brighter than anything else in the scene. It's the source of the light. So just try to prevent everything else from being overexposed. The sun's going to be overexposed, though, when it's low on the horizon, maybe obscured by some haze. It is possible to get a proper exposure for the sun. But often if you stop down enough so that you're not overexposing the sun, that means everything in the rest of the scene pretty much goes dark. So for a scene like this, I want to avoid having most of the sky around the sun being overexposed. I want to keep some of the color in that sky. I want to avoid having the rim light around the polar bear in this photo from being overexposed. I want to make sure I keep that texture, that detail, and that color. And also I want to avoid having the reflections. So for a scene like this, I could have just zoomed in on the polar bear, but I kind of zoomed out to include more color, to include the reflections, to make a more interesting composition. But another approach, and this is the approach I took for this image, was to zoom in on the bear as it was backlit by the setting sun. And this only worked when I made a photograph on a really bright sunny day. You need to have a sun that isn't blocked by anything on the horizon to get this strong effect. And I underexposed the image. I just exposed for the rim lighting around the bear and let everything else go completely dark into complete and total silhouette. And so this reveals just the abstract outline of the bear. So it's a much more artistic and abstract interpretation compared to other polar bear photos that I've made. And it's just much more graphic and it's much more interesting. It's the kind of thing that people are going to notice. They're going to see it. It's going to trigger their curiosity. It's going to stand out, images like this. And here's another example where I kind of went the other way. Instead of choosing a very dark exposure, I brightened the exposure as much as I could. And part of the reason why I did that was because here, shooting into the sun as this mother and her two cubs were walking by, the sun was a little bit lower than the previous image. So I was actually getting a lot of direct sunlight on the lens, which was creating lens flare. And when you get lens flare with a telephoto lens, that flare spreads out across the entire image frame because the telephoto lens is magnifying the flare spots. So like if this had been a wide angle lens, I would have had these like flare blobs, these little colorful blobs in the image. But with a telephoto lens, it magnifies those flare blobs. They spread across the entire image frame. And often when you're shooting with a telephoto lens, you are shooting wide open. So that spreads out and diffuses the flare as well. And so what the end result is that you end up getting this sort of warm, gauzy look as the flare spreads across the entire image frame. And so I kept my exposure as bright as I could without overexposing any of my highlights in this image so that I could retain that warm, gauzy look. So similar scene as the one before it, but a slightly different interpretation. And here's just another example, photographing a polar bear pinned against the setting sun and choosing a dark exposure. The bear is completely in silhouette, but shooting into the light here allowed me to create this artistic, this abstract rendering of the animal. Once again, this is the kind of photo that's going to really stand out to people. And here are some other examples of getting creative with backlighting. Sometimes I'll incorporate a little bit of artificial light, like some fill light. These are gelada monkeys in the highlands of Ethiopia. And I shot into the setting sun using a wide angle lens here, a little bit of fill light on the foreground, male and female that were grooming each other. By incorporating the sun, I create this eye-catching sun star. There's actually a free video up on my PhotoMaster site that talks about how you can get really great sun star effects. So you want to check that out if you haven't seen it already. And so it just allows me to create something that's more colorful, more engaging, more eye-catching than a more traditional capture. Here's a scene from the rainforest of the Pacific Northwest, which is one of the most visually chaotic places you'll ever go. I led a photo workshop there once, went to the rainforest, and I just cut everyone loose. I said, guys, go in there for an hour. We'll all meet back here and see what you can do. And this one guy comes stumbling out of the forest after an hour with this dazed look on his face. And I say, hey, how'd you do? And he just mumbled. He looked at me and kind of mumbled. It's like green spaghetti. And that was the funniest thing I'd ever heard. And he was dazed because it was just so visually bewildering. But it was a real good lesson. It was a great challenge because it can be a very difficult place to photograph. And I love to make the challenge even more. I don't just go into the rainforest on a cloudy day when everything is evenly illuminated. I go in there on a sunny day. And the sunny day creates all this alternation of shadow and light. That makes the visual chaos even more extreme, making it very, very difficult to make a coherent image. And I did a few things here to make this more coherent. I walked around for a long time until I found this one curving vine maple, and I used that curve as the basic shape of my composition. I built the entire composition around that curving shape. That helps cut through the visual chaos. And then having the setting sun as a starburst in the background, creating a focal point for the viewer. but I loved shooting into the light because all of the moss that's on the trees and all the ferns, they just glow from within when they're backlit. So it's a much more colorful and artistic rendering of the scene compared to the way people typically photograph it. And I did something similar here in the desert of Nevada with this cholla cacti. I used it to frame a sandstone formation in the background while the sun was setting right over the sandstone formation there. And so the cholla needles are all backlit by that golden light of sunset. So once again, much of the scene's in silhouette. And I was fine with that because the most interesting parts of the scene were the cholla cacti, the sandstone mound, and then the sun star. All the stuff on the ground was just kind of chaotic. So letting it fall into shadow, fall into silhouette, helped hide that chaotic stuff and focus the viewer instead on the most interesting, the most colorful parts of the scene. So the shadows conceal and the highlights reveal. So I talked earlier about how photography is connected to the moment, to this fleeting moment. The time that you expose the image, you're capturing that moment. And sometimes it's a very short period of time. Sometimes it's a longer period of time when you're doing a long exposure, but you're capturing a static view of the world. And you have to learn to like master the magic of the moment if you really want to excel at photography. You know, our world is constantly in motion, and the way human beings perceive the world is the same way a video camera does. We just see this, you know, constant cascade of one fleeting moment passing to the next. But a photograph doesn't see the world that way. A photograph freezes the world, suspending it in time forever. It creates the static capture. And this is true even if you do a long exposure, because you might capture the effect of motion over time. You might be blurring those moving elements, like a long exposure at a waterfall blurs the water, or a long exposure at night, you might get star trails, or you see clouds passing over the moon or something like that. So even though you're capturing a long period of time, it's still resulting in this static, frozen photograph. So when you trigger the shutter, that's a powerful artistic choice. So not only when you trigger the shutter, but the shutter speed you choose to use will create this altered view of reality. So for example, this is a self-portrait of me just trying to demonstrate this concept. Me jumping in the air was a fleeting moment in time, but it's preserved forever in this photograph. I love the look on my face. It's it's really awful. This is why we're looking at my photographs and not looking at my face, because they're much prettier than I am. So the photograph is going to freeze time, and motion is just rendered differently by a camera than it is seen by our eyes. And so when you're making a photograph, you're not really capturing motion. You might blur the movement of visual elements over time, but you're creating the static capture. So even if you shoot like a 20-second exposure, you're not actually capturing that movement. You're still getting this frozen photograph. So to create the illusion of motion in your photographs, the illusion of energy, you have to be creative with your compositions. So when you're doing long exposure photography, your goal is not just to capture the motion of objects over time, because you'll do that and you're not going to get very interesting photographs. What you're trying to do is capture creative, dynamic shapes. So when you photograph water moving, for example, you're trying to capture the shapes that are created by that blurring water. So with this scene from the Virgin River Narrows in Zion National Park, I did like an 8-second exposure, and that captured the water cascading over these rocks as a bunch of diagonal lines. And those diagonal lines, that curving sweep that is created by the motion blur, is what gives this photograph the feeling of motion, the illusion of energy. So it's creating all these diagonal lines that bring the viewer from the lower part of the image into the background. So whenever you're capturing motion, you got to be thinking about the shapes that are created by the motion blur. And so you can actually just freeze motion. That's one of the creative choices you have, is your shutter speed. So you shoot with a fast shutter speed, like this bear charging through the water in Alaska, captured all those water droplets frozen in air. So you need a fast shutter speed for something like this, 1/500th of a second, 1/1000th. If you're trying to capture like a hummingbird's wings, you might need 2,500th of a second, something really fast to capture the motion. So that's one way you can approach this. But once again, it's not freezing the motion that creates that feeling of energy in your photograph. It's the dynamic shapes created by the frozen motion. So all of the waves coming up around the bear here and the reflection of those waves in the water are creating these dynamic shapes. And also the bear's got a posture. It's creating a shape. It's connecting with the viewer in a meaningful way. These are the things that create the illusion of motion in your photographs. And it's the same thing with this photograph of a young orangutan in Indonesia. This cheeky little guy was swinging back and forth above me, and he was just having fun playing on the vines. And so I panned my camera as he was moving, and I used a long exposure, or a relatively long exposure considering what I was photographing. So this was about 1/30th of a second. And that's enough when you're panning the camera from left to right to create some motion blur streaks. So I wanted to create that motion blur in the background. And then I used some fill flash to freeze the motion of the orangutan. So the flash fires very quickly, and it is basically kind of, when it's illuminating something, it's kind of like doing a really fast shutter speed. And so the flash freezes the motion, and the motion blur of the camera blurs the background. And so I was able to capture both in the scene. So the motion blur in the background creates a bunch of dynamic lines going from left to right. They're kind of like motion lines in a cartoon. And so they give this illusion of movement. And then the orangutan itself has a really dynamic pose. So these things coming together create this sense of movement, even though the final photograph is completely frozen. And so here's an example. This is a scene that was not moving at all. I made this photograph in Joshua Tree National Park. The landscape certainly wasn't moving anywhere. There was this big cloud in the sky, but it was moving very, very slowly. And so when people look at this photograph, they're like, oh, you must have done a long exposure because you've got these wonderful streaking shapes of the clouds in the sky. And I'm like, well, it was a 30-second exposure, but the cloud actually wasn't moving at all during that time. The streaks that you see up there are not because of the motion blur. That was just the shape of the cloud. That really dynamic shape creates this sort of radial pattern in the sky. And then you've got the dynamic compositional shapes down below, the triangle formed by the boulder in the foreground, the curves coming in at the very bottom of the boulder that lead the eye from left to right, the dynamic triangle shapes of the background boulders. All of these shapes, lines, and textures working together create a dynamic composition. Even though there was no movement in this composition at all, it looks like it's alive. It looks like it's moving. And so you can use composition creatively to create that sense of motion. Another way to interpret, excuse me, I just need a drink of water here. Another way to interpret this idea of capturing the magic of the moment is learning how to tell a story. And there's the old saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. I think every picture you take, you should strive to make each and every one of your photographs worth 1,000 words. You should try to tell a story with all your photographs. And the story doesn't have to be the same story. It doesn't have to be the real story. It doesn't have to be the story that you're trying to tell the viewer. Chances are each and every viewer is going to come up with their own story looking at your photographs. It's enough to invite their curiosity by including enough visual elements that get them thinking and creating their own story. I call these story cues, these little tidbits, these little bits and pieces that get the viewer telling a story from your photographs. And so sometimes the story might be pretty obvious. So like I was doing some street photography in Minneapolis, and I didn't realize, but there's this thing called the naked bike ride, because I suddenly look up and there's a bunch of really young, attractive, naked people riding by on their bicycles. And I thought, okay, this might be an interesting story to tell. But when you're telling a story, it's a good idea to try to isolate the most interesting and charismatic visual elements that are out there, the ones that tell the story best. So when I saw this guy with this massive, magnificent red beard and these colorful sunglasses, I knew he was going to be the guy to tell the story. So I zoomed in and isolated the scene. I mean, I kept some of the background just to create some more visual interest, but I made him the focus of this photograph. And he played along as he got closer. He saw my camera pointing at him. He put his hand up in front of him and just sort of bellowed for me. So he was a great actor. He helped tell the story. And so finding those charismatic visual elements to help tell your story is one way of mastering the moment. And as I said, this is all about sort of isolating the most interesting part of the world that you're seeing with your eyes so that you can translate that experience for the viewer. And you can actually get actively involved in the storytelling process. This is a photograph of a mountain gorilla in Rwanda. And I had this story in my head when I went to go photograph the mountain gorillas. I was imagining these mysterious, shy creatures peering out from the depths of the forest. And I wanted to make a photograph that would tell that story. Well, it turns out they're really not that shy. You trek and you find the gorillas, and a lot of times they're just sort of out in the open in these clearings in the bamboo. And it wasn't at all the story that I was hoping to tell. It was still a magnificent experience and great photography. But I really wanted to tell this story that had been lodged in my brain. And so I saw one female gorilla. She was on the forest floor eating some plants. And it was a cleared area. There wasn't much there except for a lot of mud. And then there was this one small, scraggly little bush sticking up about 20 feet away from the gorilla. And so I got up right up to that bush. I got down on my knees and I put the bush right in front of my camera. And so basically, I was looking to frame the gorilla with the leaves. And I basically found a gap in the leaves on this bush and used the leaves to frame the gorilla because I was shooting with a telephoto lens with a wide open aperture of 2.8. That meant that I had very narrow depth of field. And since the leaves were very close to me, they ended up being completely out of focus. So it creates this abstract wash of color around the gorilla. And I use this to create the story that I wanted to tell. I mean, I was fundamentally altering reality. And it was really funny when I got down there and I was putting the bush right in front of me. One of my guides said, no, Mr. Ian, no, stand up. You'll get a better view. And I had to laugh and explain to him what I was doing. And, I did all this so I could tell that story. So I was actively engaged in the storytelling process. And you should always be engaged in the storytelling process as a photographer. You should be looking for the right position or the right conditions to tell that story. And with people and wildlife, the process of storytelling, I think, is more intuitive. I think people struggle with the idea of telling a story about the landscape. And I always try to tell a story with my landscape photos. I use the creative artistic process, for example, working with, at the edge of light and working with limited dynamic range to help tell my story. So using the alternation of light and color in a scene. Weather is a huge part of the storytelling process with the landscape. So, for example, with this scene from the redwoods of California, there was this layer of fog at the top of the trees that was scattering the light, creating these beautiful sunbeams. And so that weather component was critical to telling the story of the redwoods, to imbue them with this sense of mystery, which I think is important to incite the curiosity of the viewer. So mystery is a great way of getting people visually engaged. And so also shooting into the light, having a lot of the scene be in silhouette, having that light breaking through and hitting the foreground element, that bush at the bottom of the forest. These were all ways of enhancing the mystery to get the viewer more engaged and to focus the viewer on the most unique and most interesting parts of the landscape. That's how you tell the story of the landscape. And so, the real story and the story people extract can be two different things. Like this photograph of a double rainbow over a king penguin colony in the Falkland Islands. a lot of people, when they see this photograph, they think all the penguins are looking at the rainbow, staring at it in awe. The true story is they were facing the rainbow because the wind was coming from the opposite direction, and they were turning their backs to the wind to stay more warm. So the real story and the story that you tell to the viewer don't have to be the same thing. And here's an example of a photo I took in Namibia. And the real story were there were these 3 elephants walking across. They were going to the water hole here. But the way I used exposure creatively and composition creatively kind of altered the story and created this sense of mystery. So I shot into the light as the sun was setting. I chose a very dark exposure so that the elephants and the scene in the background went in a silhouette. And there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance here because the scene you can see above the black band in the middle and the scene you see below in the reflection look like 2 different scenes. And, working with reflections are a great way of altering reality because the reflection will look different from the scene that's being reflected based on your position relative to both of those things. So the elephants were actually crossing in the middle, but you can't see them in this silhouette image. And you could see their reflection in the water because of my angle to the water, but you couldn't see the sun, the sky, and the tree the same way in the water. So it creates that cognitive dissonance, creates that sense of mystery, makes the viewer scratch their head and wonder what's going on and start to tell their own story. When you're working with people and wildlife, eye contact can be a really important way of telling a story. But I also like working with the eyes in other ways. I think that eye contact is great to create that sort of vicarious thrill for the viewer. But when the eyes are looking in different directions, they can tell much more subtle and interesting stories. So this young gorilla looks like it's daydreaming because of its sidelong glance. And the line of sight of the eyes create an implied compositional line as well that you can use creatively. And sometimes I won't even include the eyes at all. So this is an abstract rendering of a female orangutan and her infant. So the infant was clinging to the mother, and I zoomed in really tight just to focus the viewer on the abstract shapes and colors formed by these 2 animals interlocking. And I took 2 different versions of this. I had a version where the infant was looking at me, making that eye contact, but I like this version better. Not seeing the eyes tells a more interesting story to me than if you can see the eyes. So the eyes are important, but the eyes don't always have to be looking at the camera to make effective photographs. And so to wrap up the presentation, I'm going to talk about color, using color creatively in photographs. And you got to think about color even if you're shooting black and white, because the way you separate tones in a grayscale image is by manipulating the individual colors, making them brighter or darker. So color is very important to black and white, but obviously I'm a color photographer. So I think about using color creatively. And so one important way that your camera sees the world differently than the human eye is through this process of white balancing. And I actually hate the expression white balancing because white balancing implies that you're trying to correct for color casts. So really what white balancing is that you want to make sure that your whites or your other neutrals like gray or blacks are completely neutral, that they don't have a color cast. I prefer to think of this as color balance, and it's a creative choice. And so one thing you need to understand when you're doing creative white balance, first of all, if you're shooting raw, you don't have to do this in the field when you're taking photos. You can do it in the digital darkroom without any penalty. So you don't really need to change your white balance when you're working out there, but it's a good idea to be thinking about how you might be processing the image and changing the white balance later on. So another thing is, I think people misunderstand how white balance works. I think people think that if you set it to the daylight preset, it makes everything look like daylight. And that's not what white balance does. Instead, white balance, you need to set it to match the light. So if you want to make the colors look neutral, if you're shooting in the middle of the day, then you would choose the daylight white balance setting. to make the colors look neutral, to make the colors look the way the eye perceives them. If you choose something other than daylight when you're shooting in daylight, the colors are going to look weird. So if you're shooting on a cloudy day, if you want the colors to look neutral, you select the cloudy white balance, and so on. And so as you change the white balance, the scene's going to look different. And as you run through the presets, for example, from the lower left to the lower right, you can see how this same scene, photographed in several different ways, looks completely different. The scene in the middle is probably the most faithful rendering compared to the way the eye sees it. So if you change the white balance, you can alter the scene compared to the way the eye sees it. And this is a creative choice. Unless, if you're shooting weddings, it's important to make sure that that white dress looks white. And if you're doing product photography, you want to make sure the colors are accurate. But if you're doing any other type of photography, anything goes. It's a creative choice. And so here's just an example of two different scenes. Actually, it's the same cave. This is a cave complex in Ethiopia. And these were actually both photographed with the same white balance, but the light is very different in both scenes. So the first photograph was taken near the entrance of the cave. There's a lot of light coming in, but it's not direct light. This is light that's bouncing down from the blue sky above. And as a result, everything looks a little cool. So I chose the daylight setting. If I had chosen the shade setting, that would have neutralized the colors. But here with the daylight setting, you can see some blue in this white limestone and sandstone that wouldn't have been apparent to the eye. So it looks a little bit cool with the daylight setting. As I got deeper and deeper into the cave, so the second photo on the right, you can actually see the bright part of the cave. The brightness in the background is where the first photo was taken. As I got deeper and deeper into the cave, though, the blue light wavelengths weren't making it in there. The only light wavelengths that were making it into the cave that deep were red and infrared. And so even though I shot the second photo with the same daylight setting, it looks a lot more red because that's the color of the light coming in. So the actual light and your white balance will interact to create the final colors. And so when you're thinking about this creative color balance, you should be thinking about the color wheel. And this is something artists use when they're picking and mixing colors. So what we call analogous colors are the colors that sit right next to each other, like yellow and green are analogous colors, for example. Complementary colors are opposites. So on the color wheel, yellow and blue are opposites. Cyan and red, magenta or purple, and green are opposite colors. Now, you can think of the color wheel. I think it's easier. Like, I don't carry a color wheel with me. I haven't memorized the color wheel. I just kind of prefer to think of there being three basic color choices: warm, cool, and then neutral. And so when I'm making photographs, I'm thinking about those three basic color choices. And so here's a few examples of creative color balance. So this is a photograph I made in white sands. It was in the early morning twilight, the so-called blue hour. If you're shooting with automatic white balance, your camera is going to get rid of all that blue light. It's going to try to white balance the scene and get rid of it. So after I took the photo, when I was on the computer, I changed the white balance to cool things down to preserve that blue hour look, the way things would look to the eye during that time. So it's a creative choice to shift the image more to blue. And for this photograph of a polar bear taken on a cloudy day, the white balance I chose was just a little bit cool. Not as blue as the first photo. I just brought in a little bit of cool. And the reason I did this is I wanted to tell a story. I wanted to impart on the viewer this feeling of this forlorn, barren landscape. I thought that having a little bit of a cool tone would bring in a little bit of that sort of negative mood. I wanted to convey that to the viewer. So you can use color to help tell a story. Here's some examples of going the other way. This is a warm scene. This is from Torres del Paine National Park in Chile, part of the Patagonia region of South America. Beautiful mountain area. And this scene is dominated by warmer tones like reds and pinks. And this was photographed early in the morning at sunrise. And it was a beautiful sunrise. The whole sky lit up red. And when you've got that much color in the clouds act like giant reflectors. They bounce that light down onto the landscape. And you can get some really intense colors. Now, the color that I captured with this photograph, that's not exactly the way the eye would have perceived it. The eye would not perceive a lot of that red light. Our brains do a little bit, actually, they do a lot of automatic white balance adjustment. And so sometimes there are color casts that you're not really going to notice. Like when there's a brilliant sunset, you may not really notice all the red light bouncing down onto the landscape. Your brain tends to compensate and filter some of that out. Same thing if you're photographing, let's say, a white ball on a sunny day in the shade. When that white ball is in the shade, not lit by the sun, it's illuminated by light bouncing down from the blue sky above. It actually has blue light on it. But your brain will correct the white balance. You'll perceive the ball as being white, not as being blue. But when you take a photograph and you don't make any effort to, quote unquote, white balance the image, those colors are revealed. Anyone who shot color slide film before switching to digital will know how blue the shadows would look when you made a photograph, for example. And so, when you're photographing one of those really intense sunrises or sunsets, I often will select a white balance of daylight or something similar, because that will actually reveal all that warm light, that red light hitting the landscape. And if you just rely on the automatic white balance of your camera, the camera is going to try to get rid of all that gorgeous red light and tone it down and have more neutral colors in the landscape. And here's just an example of a very warm white balance setting. So I chose to warm this up, even though a lot of the scene was in shadow. I was photographing the volcano in Iceland. And so for this photo, I just wanted to have a warm look because I wanted to have this energetic look to the final composition. So the warmth really helped tell that story. Here's an example of how you can use color creatively. I'm always looking for really strong pops of color. This is from the Namibia desert, an area called the Deadvlei. And there are these beautiful orange sand dunes that are rising up above this dead forest in the desert floor. And the sand is actually orange because there's iron oxide in it. The sand dunes are literally rusting. And so that pop of color was best revealed by keeping the clay pan at the bottom neutral, by keeping that white. So that white and that orange creates this really colorful, dynamic color scheme. I'm often looking for complementary colors. So if I've got pinks at sunset, I want to bring in some blues as well. And so having some mixed lighting on the scene, like mixed light and shadow, or just some of the clouds in the sunset sky going off, but other clouds being in shadow, when you work with a wide angle lens, you can capture that mixed lighting and that mixed color. So the blues and the pinks here are roughly color opposites, warm versus cool. And that just brings in a lot of extra color and makes the overall composition more vibrant, having those complementary colors. Same thing with this scene from the Grand Tetons. There was fog down below, storm clouds up above. So there's different layers of light and shadow. I took this at sunrise. And there's also different layers created by the colors. So the colors emphasize the alternation of shadow and light. So the two work together to create this really dynamic and colorful layered image. And here's the volcano in Iceland again. Used my drone to fly over the volcano and look down in between eruptions. And so there's a lava lake boiling down below. And I chose to make this photograph after the sun had set, when the landscape was in the twilight. I chose my moment carefully to balance the light so that the lava and the light, the ambient light on the landscape, were more or less equal in exposure value. And also choosing that moment when the scene was in shadow and then choosing a white balance, I actually cooled the white balance down so that I could capture that twilight light on the landscape. So yeah, by cooling down the image, I lose some of the vibrance of the oranges and the reds, but it doesn't matter. When you have that complementary color scheme, those opposite colors juxtaposed against one another, it makes each look more vibrant. So the blue and the red together look much more vibrant than if I had kept this image warmer. The red would have looked more vibrant. I would have lost the blues. I would have lost that complementary color scheme, and I would have lost the color vibrancy here. Here's just another example, shooting some ice caves along the south shore of Lake Superior, shifting the white balance overall just a little bit cool so that the ice on the inside of the cave gets rendered blue. And I did this because I had this gentleman who was on my photo tour who had this bright orange jacket on. He agreed to pose. He was being asked to pose for everyone's pictures. He made the mistake of wearing a bright orange jacket. Never do that if you're on a photo tour, because you're going to be asked to be in everyone's pictures. But it was great, that by cooling the image down, losing some of the vibrancy of the orange, adding that complementary blue to the scene more than made up for what was lost. And so having that pop of color really makes him stand out in this wide angle composition. I was super close to the ice. So the ice looks huge because I'm manipulating the scene with my focal length and my relative position. So the ice looks enormous, even though the individual icicles were pretty small. He looks a lot smaller because he's farther away, but that pop of color really makes him stand out. And this is a scene from Sumatra in Indonesia, a Sumatran orangutan swinging across the scene with her infant. And I used just a little bit of fill flash, very low power, to help reveal the wildlife subjects against that bright background. When you're deep in the rainforest, everything's in shadow. And so for a wide angle scene like this, actually taken with a fisheye lens, I needed just a little bit of fill flash to get that pop of color. And that creates that complementary color scheme. That orange against that green makes everything really stand out, makes my subject really stand out. And so by manipulating the color choices and the relative light through the photographic process, I was able to emphasize my subject, make it stand out from the background, and really tell its story. That moment when the subject looked directly at me, that eye contact from the infant, was really what brought the entire scene together and helped create that vicarious connection with the viewer that's so important. So just remember that a photograph should tell the viewer as much about the artist as it does about the subject. So you should always be striving to inject your personal vision into every photograph that you make. And if you want to learn more, you can go to my personal website, ianplant.com. You can check out PhotoMasters, download, register for my free webinar. My photo workshops and tours are on ianplant.com. Everything for the rest of the year is booked up except for one tour. I'm doing a tour in December with Munch Photo Workshops, and they're really eager to get some more people on the tour. So they are offering $2,500 off if you just put Ian Plant in the discount code. So hopefully you guys will join me in Antarctica. It's a photo experience of a lifetime. I think this is going to be a lot of fun. And of course, you can learn about my workshops and tours for next year as well on my personal website. So that's it for me. I'm going to stop my share and see if we have any questions.
Thank you, Ian. That was wonderful. Everybody, you can mute yourself. And we have a question in from Dick Mesner. Dick, would you want to ask Ian your question, please?
Yes, Ian. We had a tickler here in the front about you using wide-angle lens quite a bit. And I have one quick question, maybe two parts to it. Briefly explain how or why a wide-angle lens tells the landscape story better than something else, some other type of lens. And how do you handle the wide-angle lens with a distant mountain being made to look further away?
Yeah, those are some fantastic questions. And so the challenge of working with a wide-angle lens is it makes everything look small. But the benefit of working with a wide-angle lens is that you can dramatically manipulate the relative size of objects by changing your focal length if you're working with a wide-angle zoom, and also by changing your relative position. So what I love about the wide-angle lens is it makes the background small, but you can get close with the wide-angle lens to a foreground object and make it look big and bring it into the composition. And so that, I think that helps maybe tell a little bit more about the story of the landscape when you're working with a wide-angle lens. But I love that manipulation of scale, because by making the background scenery a little bit smaller than the foreground, you're creating this dynamic visual arrangement. You're basically creating, if you want to think of it in very basic terms, sort of a triangle shape with, a pointy end being at the top of the scene where the landscape scenery is. So there's this narrowing of perspective when you've got that big foreground going to that smaller background that creates these implied diagonal lines that are converging. And you could definitely see that with a lot of my wide angle landscape photos. So it's this narrowing of perspective, these converging implied or real diagonal lines, depending on what you're photographing, or these, converging shapes that really just draws the viewer in. It just basically grabs them and pulls them into the composition and doesn't let go. But that big foreground is big enough and strong enough and interesting enough. It pulls the viewer back, starting their journey through the image all over again. So it's a great way of holding the viewer's interest over time. So that's why I love working with wide angle lenses, not only with landscapes, but with wildlife, because of that dramatic effect. And if you find a really interesting foreground, you can really add a lot of visual interest to your overall photograph. And also the wide angle lens lets you bring in more stuff in the sky. So if you've got dramatic weather, which I talked about how important that is to telling the story of the landscape, the wide angle lens helps you do that. Now, I don't always use a wide angle lens when I'm photographing landscapes. You can definitely tell a great story using longer lenses. You can do intimate photography, but that's what I love about doing the wide angle stuff. The main challenge of wide angle landscape photography is that sometimes your background goes too small. And so there's two things you can do in those situations. One, you can simply just zoom in a little bit. So I tell people, you're working with a wide angle zoom, you zoom to decide the size of your background subject. And then you change your position to alter the size of your foreground subject. But the other thing you can do is even if you zoom in some, your background is still too small, is you can find a way to get closer to the background, which sometimes is easier said than done, depending on, where the background is. If it's a big mountain in Patagonia, it might, involve a long hike, though preferably you can take maybe a shorter bus ride or something like that to get closer to the scenery if your wide angle is rendering it too small. So, definitely wide angle photography can be challenging because of what we've talked about. It's also challenging because you're bringing in so much stuff in. So you've got to find a way to incorporate all that stuff into your final composition. So I call it the art of inclusion. When you're working with a telephoto lens, you're excluding stuff. You're simplifying the scene. I call that the art of exclusion. With a wide angle lens, you need to learn how to master the art of inclusion, figure out a way to bring all these pieces together to make a compelling composition. So hopefully that answers your question. That was a great question. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions?
Ian, this is Dave Marchetto. Fabulous presentation. It seems like the wide angle lens is one of the most difficult to excel at. Did you ever worry about protecting the front element of your lens because you get so close? And if you put a filter on, does that degrade your image? And you sort of risk it.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't think that a filter really degrades the image as long as you keep the filter clean and free of scratches. The degradation of the image quality is minimal. I don't use filters to protect my wide angle lenses, mainly because I'm working with ultra wides. So the ultra wide lenses have got these bulbous front elements, these Popeye lenses, and it's really difficult to work with filters on them.
Right. Right.
And I used to buy these huge, expensive, oversized filter holders, and they would always just fall off and break, and it would be like, okay, I just wasted another $500. So I gave up. I actually don't use filters that much at all in my photography anymore.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that can be a problem. Though honestly, I've only damaged a few of my wide angle lenses over the years. So,
what equipment do you use, Ian? In a word, what what type of equipment do you stick with? One maker or not?
Yeah, so I shot Canon for most of my professional career, and I accidentally switched to Sony recently. So I'm shooting Sony now, and people are like, "Well, why did you switch to Sony?" I love the Canon system. I'm not really wedded to any particular system, but I do a lot of work with Tamron, and Canon stopped playing nice with the third-party manufacturers. So all of Tamron's new lenses were being made for Sony, and so they basically were like, they're like, "Hey, we want you to like photograph with this new lens and do an assignment for us." I'm like, "Well, I don't shoot Sony." They're like, "Well, we'll send you a camera." So they'd send me a loaner camera, and I was carrying around two camera systems, my Canon system and then this like loaner Sony system. And I finally said, "That's crazy." So I switched to Sony. And so now I am shooting fully with the Sony system. In terms of lenses, most of my lenses are Tamron lenses, but one thing that Tamron does not make for Sony is an ultra wide zoom lens. So my Tamron lenses end at 35 millimeters, and then after that it's a mix. I've got a Sony 12-24 ultra wide angle zoom lens, which is my go-to lens for wide angle work. And then I've got a third-party fisheye lens and a third-party 9 millimeter lens because 12 millimeters on a full-frame camera just isn't wide enough for me. So that's when I reach for the 9 millimeter lens.
It's just fabulous presentation. Really, really, we're fortunate to have you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I can follow up with a question about filters. You say you don't use them much anymore. How about a polarizer?
So a polarizer filter is one of those filters that I think can still be very, very critical. Like a lot of other filters that people used to use, there are digital workarounds for many of those things, but a polarizer is still kind of unique. And a polarizer is designed to remove reflections. And so for scenes like waterfalls, it can be really useful to help you get rid of glare on wet rocks and in the water, and also to make the color of foliage pop out and really stand out a lot more. But because I'm shooting with these ultra wide angle lenses, I'm not using polarizers. I've learned how to shoot without a polarizer if I'm shooting waterfalls, and it's got a different look. You can process the photo, you can bring down the glare and reduce the highlights and give it a quasi polarizer look, but it's a little bit different. I've learned to like the way it looks without the polarizer. But yeah, that's something that I do still recommend people use a polarizer for that kind of photography.
Okay. Anybody else have any other questions? You haven't talked about post-processing. Just briefly, what's your philosophy?
I'm a photography traditionalist. I shot color slide film for 20 years before I switched to digital, 10 years before I switched to digital, actually. And I loved the way it looked. And to me, that's what photography was. Like photography was everything you did before you triggered the shutter. There was no post-processing. You sent your color slide film to a lab and got it back, and that was your final photograph. And so I've been a little slow to embrace digital post-processing. I tend to process with a fairly light touch with most of my images. I do embrace some of the technical workarounds like focus stacking and HDR. I think these are useful tools, but I don't like altering the fundamental reality in the digital darkroom as captured through the photographic process. So there's a lot of photographers that even before AI have been doing like massive compositing of photos. They'll take a sunset from here and a foreground from there and a mountain background from something else that they took 2 years ago, and they'll smash it all together and create this nuclear explosion of digital awesomeness. And it looks beautiful, but to me, that's not really photography. That's more of a mixed media, more of a computer generated art. So I try to keep as close to the tradition of photography. Before color slide film, there of course was the darkroom tradition of Ansel Adams and other black and white photographers. So I embrace everything that they embraced, but I'm trying to avoid fun. Like I want to enhance and optimize my images, in the digital darkroom, but I don't want to fundamentally alter their reality. If that makes sense.
Yeah,
So I would say on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being a complete Luddite who just shoots raw images and doesn't do any processing, and 10 being, the most extreme Photoshop manipulator you can imagine, I probably come in at maybe between a 2 and a 3, I guess.
How about increasing the color contrast by cooling the shadows and warming the highlights?
Yeah, though, so that, that used to be called split toning back in the day, as you're probably aware. And that's something I tend not to do myself. I'll adjust the white balance and find like a compromise position. Okay. But I usually I sometimes avoid split toning, a lot of times avoid split toning, because I sometimes think it can look a little weird if you're not careful. And so that's not something I personally do, but it's kind of similar. I'm looking for that effect through capturing mixed light scenes so that I know I'm going to get that split tone look. I'm just kind of doing it the old fashioned way.
Very good. Very good. And one final question for me. A lot of photographers are advised to simplify their compositions, but having taken your course, I know that that's not really your philosophy. You're more into complex composition. Yeah. Do you want to just comment on that?
Yeah, I love complex compositions. I think learning how to simplify is the way you start learning composition. Learning the art of exclusion, what I mentioned earlier, learning how to hone in on only the barest essential elements. And once you master the art of exclusion, and it's easier to do that with like a telephoto lens, when you can zoom in and isolate a portion of the scene. Once you've mastered that, once you've figured out what to include and more importantly, what to exclude, then you can start taking a wider view and working with more visually complex scenes and learn how to master the art of inclusion. So the wider you get, the more extreme the lighting situations are. These things are going to increase visual complexity. And even when I'm working with a visually complex scene, I'm looking for a way to simplify the composition. So for example, that photograph from the rainforest that I showed you guys, where I talked about walking around for an hour, looking for one simple shape to bring the composition together, looking for that arcing tree, that was the shape that helped simplify. There's still a lot of visual chaos, but when you have that bold graphic shape, it distracts the viewer from the visual chaos and focuses their attention on the more simple graphic part of the scene. And that's something also when you're working with a big foreground in a landscape photo, that big foreground shape also helps simplify the scene. You've still got all the visual chaos in the background, but the viewer is focused on that big foreground shape, and that helps cut through the chaos. So even when you're working with a chaotic scene, you're looking for ways to trick the viewer into thinking it's a much more simple scene than it really is. So that's basically how you do it. Easier said than done, right?
and you didn't even use the term secondary visual anchors.
Oh, don't even get me started on visual anchors.
All right. Other questions, guys? We still have 41 people online. Anybody want to ask a question of Ian while we have him captive? Okay, that's sufficient wait time. Joe, how about you? Anything? Oh, Ian, this has been wonderful. Guys, would you unmute yourselves, please, and let's do the traditional thing we do. Let's give Ian a nice round of applause.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Great job. Great job. Outstanding.
Well done.
It was interesting. Very interesting.
Well done.
Okay. I'm not sure what happened to Joe. We lost him, so let me wrap things up here. Ian, this has been a real pleasure. I've been following you for years and recommend you to all of the students in my classes. So I appreciate your willingness to come online and speak with our group. I admire you a lot and appreciate your effort tonight. Very well done.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for the kind words. And it was great connecting with you guys virtually. And hopefully we can hook up in the real world sometime. So thanks a lot, guys.
That would be very nice. So guys, check out his website.
Bye-bye.
Fantastic
Take care.
presentation.
Thank you and good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you.